Okay, we'll carry on today looking at the build-up to the Battle of Hastings, which led, of course, to the Norman conquest of England, and look at the battle itself. So Hassan will be our presenter, and he will speak about the battle. So I will continue talking about the kind of political background, and then we shall look at the claims to the English throne prior to the battle. There'll be a slight overlap, I think, with what Hassan will say, but not too much. So depending on how long I take, and as you know I like to talk, either Hassan will present in the first half, or perhaps after the break he'll present, and then I'm hoping we'll have time to have a look at the Bayeux Tapestry. And I hope that all or most of you have surfed that website and had a look at the tapestry online, which I requested you to do. Okay, so we've been looking at the events in England from the reign of Ethelred the Unready down to the reign of his son Edward the Confessor. In the meantime, we saw briefly under Sweyn Forkbeard, but more successfully under his son Canute, the ruling family of Denmark established themselves in England. So not just a period of Viking or Scandinavian return to English politics, but in this case Anglo-Saxon kings were removed and Danes were in power instead. At the same time, we see the first stage in this involvement of Normandy, this principality, duchy in northern France, the encroachment of Normandy into kind of English politics through the marriage of Ethelred, and then later through the marriage of his successor Canute to Emma, who was a member of the ducal line of Normandy. Okay, and so a great aunt or something like that of William, who eventually becomes King of England. During the period of Canute's reign and the brief reigns of his two sons, Harold and Harthacnut, the main members of the older Wessex English line, children of Ethelred, here represented by Edward and Edmund, they spend time in exile, and Edward spends time in his mother's country in Normandy, so he grows up effectively in Normandy. Okay, his perspective is Norman. And finally, as we saw, during the short reign of Harthacnut, Edward comes back to England and establishes or becomes recognized as heir for Harthacnut. So he's reinstated. Harthacnut has no one to succeed him immediately. But it's important to stress that Edward's background is very un-English. He was not really very well prepared in some ways to enter the English scene, and the people who support him, his friends and followers of his court, if you want, are to some extent Norman. Secondly, that all this has passed in between his reign and that of his father. So the people who were set up in power under Canute primarily, and we referred to these people, the aristocrats, as rather than just Danish, but we call them often the Anglo-Danish aristocracy under Canute, were not entirely, but significantly a very different bunch of guys from those who had power under Ethelred. Okay, there were some very important English or Anglo-Saxon families still in power, like, as we said, the Earls of Wessex, as they become known. But many of the big guys controlling things in England were new people, often of Danish descent. So when Edward becomes king, he succeeds Harthacnut, and he's crowned, I think, in fact, king technically in 1043. He's just returned not long ago from Normandy, And the people ruling around him were not his father's men. They were different people to some extent. Okay, the scene was rather unfamiliar in various ways. There is a tradition which stresses that Edward encouraged his French and Norman friends into positions of power. Okay, that naturally, because he's coming from northern France, and the people who supported him when he was young were from there, that he gave positions of power, important bishoprics and other things to Normans. And to some extent that's true. This definitely happened. We have notable examples of Normans being given positions of power instead of English or Anglo-Danish guys or whatever. But it's not 100%. It's not in the same way that William the Conqueror later on more or less replaced the whole Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with his own Normans, northern French people. But there's an element of that going on. And of course that will cause a certain resentment. No one likes a new guy coming in and bringing his new friends and saying, okay, we're going to put new people in power, you're all out of power, and so on. So there's that element, okay, which is both traditional and has some part of truth in it. Also important for his reign is his relationship with Godwin, okay, the Earl of Wessex. As I said last time, these new earls, like Godwin and Leofric in Mercia, and Siward in Northumbria, and basically Godwin controls a large part of the south part of England, and his sons, Harold and some others. These people were very powerful, okay? They controlled a lot of land, and because of, particularly during this period, the kind of dynastic uncertainties after Canute during the reigns of Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, they were able to consolidate and build up their power even more. And probably Edward didn't actually like Godwin, because a number of years earlier, Edward's brother Alfred had tried to make an expedition into England to try and set himself up, or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what the plan was, but and Godwin, they'd fought against him, and Godwin or his army had killed Alfred. So Edward probably had a certain resentment against this powerful earl, who had in fact been responsible for killing his brother, amongst other things. But effectively, he couldn't do anything about it initially. Okay, he was a new king, he was in a very unstable position, and one of the most powerful guys in the kingdom was Godwin. So he had to accept this, and he had to work with this guy. But we see gradually attempts to, whether deliberately or not, attempts to kind of undermine or go against Godwin's position. Okay, he puts in some new people and so on in power against what Godwin would have liked. And most significantly, there is the so-called rebellion of 1051. Events carry on until 1052 as well. And what happens here is, now how am I going to represent this on my diagram properly? Okay. Among the Frenchmen that Edward favours was his brother-in-law, okay, Eustace of Boulogne, who was married to Edward's sister, or had been married. And in 1051, Edward seems to be sending Eustace, so a foreigner, Yabanja, a Frenchman, into Dover, which is just here, okay, to maybe set up a castle or something. And Eustace arrives, and he's got a big gang of his followers as well. And naturally, the local English people kind of resent these foreigners coming in and taking over. And there seems to have been, possibly there was some trouble as well. Someone got killed or something, there was a certain amount of fighting, and then it escalates. And as a result, quite a lot of a number of the Frenchmen are murdered or killed in the fighting. Edward then gets upset, okay, when Eustace complains, and this area was part of Godwin's territory. So he says, okay, you go in and punish these people. They have been bad boys and killed my French friends. And Godwin refuses, okay, which you don't do. You don't say no to the king unless you think you can back that up. So that's more or less an implicit challenge to the position of the king. He says, no, I'm not going to go and do that. So then Godwin goes off and starts building up his army. He knows that there's going to be trouble. The king, however, gets the support of Leofric in Mercia and Siward in Northumbria, naturally, because they resent the fact that Godwin is a powerful guy. So the other earls support the king against Godwin. They all meet together, and basically he and his family are sent off. They're sent in exile, and their lands are taken away from them. Godwin, I think, goes to the continent, and one of his sons Harold ends up in Ireland for a while, and they get some support, and eventually they're able to come back and get reinstated in 1052. Okay, but for a while there was a crisis, a rebellion, and almost an attempt to remove them from power. Godwin dies in 1053, and he's followed as Earl of Wessex by his son Harold. Okay, he has a number of other sons we should mention, most significantly a guy called, spelt various ways, Tostig we should put there as well. And he becomes eventually Earl up in Northumbria. So we've got Harold down here and Tostig up here. So this family is controlling a large part of the country. Okay. Harold also has some victories. He has some major victories against the growing power of the Welsh. So both politically and also militarily, he's in a very strong position. Okay. He doesn't challenge the king directly like his father had done, I don't think, but there's no denying that he is perhaps the most powerful person after the king in England at that time. Okay, that brings us up to the eventual death in 1066 of King Edward. Okay, I should briefly mention the fact that during his reign, this young man, who's probably in his early teens, 13 or 14 or something, called Edgar Atheling, returns from Germany or Hungary or somewhere to England at this time. Yeah, guys, don't talk, it's disturbing me. Okay, thanks. He is, apart from Edward, he is the only direct descendant of Ethelred who's around and may be in a position to legitimately become king. Okay, his father had died about 10 years earlier. He married a German woman, and he is therefore the grandson of Edmund, who had briefly been king after Ethelred. So there is a legitimate claimant to the throne from the House of Wessex, from the descendants of Alfred the Great, but he's very young and he has no real power base. And he comes back to England during the reign of Edward, but he doesn't have any great support or basis for power at this time, but he's there. Okay, so when we say there's no real heir, family heir for Edward, it's technically not true. This guy is actually around. Okay, so let's look at who claims to be king at this time. Okay, Edward the Confessor is getting old. He's in the process of eventually dying. So who are the people who claim his throne after him? Firstly, we have this gentleman, who I hope you've seen already if you've looked at the Bayeux Tapestry. This is who? William. Okay, you've got the VV there, Will beginning his name. Okay, this is William, Duke of Normandy. Now, he had a number of claims, a number of ways that he might justify his claim to the throne. Okay. Firstly, we could mention the fact that very distantly, and he wasn't a direct blood descendant, but he was related somehow to the various kings of England for the previous 50 years or so. He had a kind of genealogical connection through his great aunt Emma or whatever, but he was not descended from the kings in any way, so he didn't have any Anglo-Saxon royal blood, so it was a very distant one. I don't think you could play a lot on that, okay? But it may be important at the same time. He also claims, it's also claimed that perhaps around about this time, that Edward the Confessor had promised the throne of England to William. Okay? Perhaps during this rebellion period when he was very uncertain of his position and he was fearful of what Godwin and his family might do, to strengthen his position, to make sure what he wanted was the case, it's claimed that he had promised and said that William will be my heir. Okay? So the king had named William as his heir. We don't actually have a document from the period that states this. Okay, it would have been something spoken, but it was a claim that the Normans made, and this is something that they believed in.
Did he have made it public, or is this just something he would have said, or did he tell other nobles in England, I plan to make William?
It wasn't something that we have a written document of. I, Edward, hereby declare William, but in some kind of a meeting, and it suggested that William might have even gone to England at some point, that they had a meeting and other people would have been there who would have witnessed this. Okay, we don't have any documentary proof. And obviously, as a result of the ways that historical sources survive, one man's claim is as good as another. Okay, so it was made, and it wasn't, I'm sure it just wasn't kind of one-to-one. There would have been other people there who would have then kind of stood back and thought, okay, I'll remember this if I need to, and if it's a politically good idea or something. So we don't have strong documentary proof, only after the event, including the Bayeux Tapestry, possibly, as we shall see later on. But this is one of the claims they make, okay? And it's not unlikely, okay, given the nature of their relationship and so on. So we have his possible his possible promise and this very vague genealogical connection, okay? Also, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail afterwards, we have the strange nature of what is sometimes called Heralds Oath. Now, can anyone, have you looked at the Bayeux Tapestry? What happens, what's the nature of Harold's visit to France? Cengiz?
I just know the background before. I didn't get it from the Bayeux Tapestry, but I read in another source that he was being sent to France. He was shipwrecked. He was taken captive by someone I can't remember. And
Count of Ponthieu.
And then William arranged his release, and then he pledged an oath to William.
Yes, there's some kind of an oath going on. He receives arms. We'll see all the pictures later on, and exactly what the nature of all this is not clear. Okay. And in some versions, it's suggested he's kind of supporting or agreeing to William's claim, okay? And in some cases, it even said he's gone there for that reason. Other reasons for his expedition are alternatives that are given, okay, that don't include this. So this is, again, it's not clear, it's not definite, but one extra element is that Harold allegedly was under William and supposedly supported or gave an oath promising to support William as king after Edward. Okay, Fatih?
As I see from the text, it's after a war which he joined with William to the Brittany, Conan.
The Duke of Brittany. Yeah.
Because of that, the researchers think that the war is related with his promise to support William.
Yeah, it's all tied in together. I mean,
Because in the previous picture of the tapestry, William gave him some kind of artifacts to honor his success in war, and because of that, the oath.
yeah, it could be purely a feudal oath, of course. I mean, we don't know what was said. Yeah, you've both said lots about the tapestry, so we're jumping ahead of ourselves in detail. But well, of course, yeah. I mean, if you're there in Normandy, you've been shipwrecked, you've got nothing, you've just been brought as a prisoner from Ponthieu and so on, and someone says, do this, say this, then unless you're stupid, you're going to say yes, okay? So, of course, there's a whole, we'll debate these, hopefully, if we've got time later on. But there's some idea, suggestion, that he made some promise, some oath at least to be under William, or whether through coercion or willingly, and it's suggested that he may have also promised to support William's claim. Okay, so William is claiming to have the support of the most powerful man in England at that time, though as he lies on a beach in France, shipwrecked or whatever, he wasn't exactly very powerful. As you say, his position was a bit more compromised. So okay, so that's one claimant, okay, and this is the eventual winner, so we can mention him first. The second claimant, and I think the picture is going to be here, and this is another tapestry picture. There he is swearing his oath on the relics. We'll see this one again later on. Is Harold himself, okay, Harold Godwinson. Now he has a number of claims as well. Okay, he could support his position. His sister was married to the king, and through these other marital connections, he was also connected to Canute's family. Again, not direct blood descendant. This guy has the best blood claim, but Harold had a number of connections to the families, which is a natural product of kind of royal and aristocratic families, but he had some kind of claim or something to work on at the same time. Okay. It's also been suggested that because of his powerful position, because he was the most powerful man in England after the king in 1066, militarily and politically, it's suggested, or it's been said, that Edward promised the throne to Harold on his deathbed. Okay, it's stated in some of the sources. So Harold might say, well, he may have promised it to William first, but he changed his mind and promised it to me afterwards, or something like that. And on his deathbed, that was when he made his final statement. So both William and Edward claimed that, William and Harold claimed that Edward had made them or promised them to be his heir. You could either claim, well, I was the first one, so that's a stronger claim, or you can say, as a second one, that supersedes or replaces the other one. Altai? Well, this is the swearing of the oath on relics. We'll come to that later on. Okay, I just wanted to have a picture here. We'll look at the details of what some of these pictures mean later on. This is just one of the images that I found. So these are, in a sense, the two main claimants to the throne. Okay, Harold, who was de facto the most powerful man in England at that time. William, the most powerful man in northern France, and they both had kind of vague genealogical connections to Edward, not so important really, but they also had both claimed to have been promised the throne by the king at different times. Who is the third, well, excluding the teenage Edgar, the prince, Edgar Atheling, who is the third guy who actually does make a bid for power? King of Norway. Let's clean the board before we stick this up, because Harold Hardrada. Harald, we'll use the more Norse spelling here. Hardrada, as it's often given in kind of anglicised form. Haraldrardi, or something like that. The hard counsel, strong counsel, or something like that. That's the same word as we get in unready for Athelred before. Does anyone know the nature of his claim? I don't know how much detail you went into, Hassan or anyone else. What's the basis of Harold Hardrada, who's king of Norway, to this? It's a rather complicated, it's a little bit kind of tenuous and stretched, though allegedly, if it's true, there is a basis, a sort of legal basis for this. We have to go back a bit further. Previous king of Norway, called Magnus the Good, who was contemporary with Harthacnut, okay, son of King Canute. So he's also king of Norway. according to some sources, and I'll read the one from the Viking Icelandic saga. This is from the saga of Magnus the Good. It's an account of his reign. And I've written the page down where it was, so if I can find it here. Okay, that Harthacnut, who becomes king of England, but had some trouble in Denmark because the Norwegians were kind of struggling over Denmark. Okay, but eventually, okay, and he has England as well after his father. So there is, England is kind of clear, but it takes a while to get there. That's why he doesn't replace his brother immediately. Magnus is making claims and so on against him in Scandinavia. This is Scandinavian politics. But these guys allegedly come to some kind of agreement, okay? And what it says in the saga is they agree that if one of them, Harthacnut or Magnus, should die without leaving a son, without a legitimate son as heir, the longest liver, the other one, should succeed to the whole land and people. Okay? 12 principal men in each kingdom took oaths with the kings that this treaty should be observed so long as any one of them was in life. And the kings separated, blah, blah, went to their own kingdom. So what it's saying here is that these two guys made an agreement that if one of them dies without a son, the other guy would take over his lands. So if Harthacnut dies without a son, Magnus gets England and Denmark, and if Magnus dies, Harthacnut gets Norway, as well as obviously England and Denmark. As we know, Harthacnut died and was replaced by Edward the Confessor, and Magnus dies in 1047, and he is replaced eventually by a relation, not a son, but a distant relation, Harold, son of Sigurd, Harold Hardrada. Okay, he becomes the next king. Now, technically, therefore, he could say, well, I am the successor of this king of Norway, so I have inherited this promise. I have inherited the fact that I should succeed Harthacnut. It's passed on to me. Now what happens is, just before the battle, just before the build-up to Hastings, Harold isn't in good relations with his brother, Tostig, who had for a while been, had been Earl of Northumbria, and Tostig allegedly goes to King Harold in Norway and tries to persuade him to come over. So I've got that quotation again from Harold's saga, page 222 to 223, so if I can find that. Okay, here is Tostig, Toste as they call him here, speaking to King Harold. If you will not tell me, I will tell you. Magnus the Good, subdued Denmark because all the chiefs of the country helped him, and you have not done it because all the people of the country were against you. Therefore, King Magnus did not strive for England. He didn't achieve England because all the nation would have wanted to have King Edward for king. What's going to happen to England now? And then he says, he suggests, no, I've lost the place again, excuse me. Okay, everyone recognizes you to be a great warrior in the north, and it appears extraordinary that you are fighting for so long for Denmark, and you should take England as well. Okay, so Tostig has been banished from England, he's fighting against his brother, and he's decided to kind of remind Harold of his possible claim to England. Okay, and then Harold, with Tostig, decides to make a play for England. And Hassan will tell us briefly about the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the north, when they do arrive in the north, and Harold, the other Harold, this Harold, King Harold, has to fight against them. Okay, so our three main players: Harold, who becomes king for a short while, William, who eventually becomes king, and the Norwegian making this claim from a distance. And though we mentioned him a few times, poor old Edgar pretty much out of the picture, though he is proclaimed king briefly a little bit later on, but nothing comes of that. He's never crowned king or anything like that. Okay, so that's the background scene. We've built up the politics and we've named the people. Okay, let's have a look at the tapestry then, and I hope some of you, if not all of you, had a chance to browse this website, and there are comments and so on top. Now, what do we know about the tapestry itself? Before we actually look at some of the scenes and so on, do we know much about it, where it comes from, who created it, why, and things like that? An attempt to understand and use an historical source must ask these basic questions before we actually try and reconstruct events or society from it.
I can't remember the name of the person who created it, but it was obviously created not too long after the battle. I mean, it's a form of Norman propaganda. I mean, it shows the success of their battle, and then kind of legitimizes their battle.
Yeah, okay, the first big question you've answered there is this is a Norman account of the build-up to Hastings and briefly the aftermath and the crowning, though it's not shown explicitly, of William the Conqueror. This is not an English, or Anglo-Saxon, I should say, account of that. So it's a Norman one, it's a Norman. Poitiers.
But even though it's a...
What about, why are we mentioning...
Was he historian or designer?
William of Poitiers was a historical writer, yes, a Norman historical writer. I've not come across anything which suggests he's connected with that, but there could be a new theory or something. But he's a Norman writer around that time. Some traditionally it's been attributed to like the ladies in waiting of William the Conqueror's wife or something like that. But I think that idea is not so much accepted these days. One of the most common theories is that it was commissioned by William the Conqueror's half-brother, okay, by his brother by a different lady, Odo of Bayeux, Bishop of Bayeux, who appears more than once in the tapestry. And the tapestry was originally found, I think, in the cathedral now at Bayeux, so it was there in what had been his episcopal seat, obviously a different church in the 11th century. And he was a very important figure for William in the early days of the conquest and so on. So some people have suggested more recently that somehow it was set up by him. And in fact, it may have even been made physically embroidered by English ladies under his power somewhere in the south of England, in Kent, I think, is where his power base was. Then there have been more, like all things in history where there is no definite answer, there have been more theories recently of different interpretations. I think someone has even argued that really it's not Norman propaganda, it's very indirectly Anglo-Saxon propaganda, but I can't really see that one myself. But it's this very, very long, well, it's called a tapestry, but it's essentially, I think more correctly, an embroidery, okay, sewing cotton onto cloth. I've actually been to see it, okay, you can go to Bayeux and you hold a little thing, if you want to hear it in English, you hold the headphone in English, and as you walk around, different sort of descriptions get activated, so it tells you how it is and so on. And it is very long, it goes around this big long room and so on. Quite an achievement. It's kind of unique insofar as it's like the only picture or comic book history source which we have, which is actually quite important for British or European history in this period. And I should briefly mention, of course, that it's not the only source of these things. The accounts that we've been talking about and what Hassan used are based not only on the Bayeux Tapestry, which in itself doesn't give a lot of detail, but also we have English sources which tell what happened. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle carries on after the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, technically, and we have accounts in Old English about that. And even in the 12th century, we have writers, some of them technically English, writing against the Normans, sort of, and others a bit more pro-Norman because they're under the Norman kings. And then we have a number of Norman and French writers, including William of Poitiers, whom Hassan mentioned, who obviously have, again, the Norman or French perspective on these things and so on. And we have historical things and things which are a bit more literary and so on. Okay, so putting all these together is what the historians argue about when they want to reconstruct the events themselves. Okay, let's have a look at the time we've got left, just under half an hour. And I want to leave a little bit early today. I have to collect my daughter from school, so let's give ourselves about 20 minutes or so to zip through some of these scenes, if this will work. Did that open? There we go. No. Is that, oh dear, that's not what I was expecting to be kind of bigger. Can you see very well? No, let me have a look. Okay, yeah, you can't see all the finer detail, but we can point to some things here. Okay. So we begin the story. Let's begin our story in London, Westminster in London. Here is Edward the Confessor. Okay, and he's talking to which of these guys? I think this one at the front must be Harold. Okay, and then Harold sets off with his knights, okay, to Bosham. He's making a journey, setting off to his family estate, then he's going to go on a journey. He's being told to go somewhere by Edward, but it doesn't say what the nature of the expedition is. Okay, it doesn't say he's been sent to go and promise the throne to William or something like that. It just says that they meet and then he sets off and so on this journey. So that sets the scene in a sense, the two guys together. Then they get ready for this journey that they're preparing. So it says they pray, so they go to the church, and then off they set across the sea. Here we go across the sea to presumably northern France, Normandy, but it doesn't explicitly say where they're supposed to be going either. Then they have trouble, okay. They don't quite have the journey they want, and Guy, who is Count Guy of Ponthieu, which I don't have, that's not my map, but it's a little bit to the east of Normandy. They end up going too far east, and he is captured, apprehended by Guy, okay, which is what we talked about before, this neighbour there. Now he's being taken to Guy's main town, and then meanwhile some nuntii, messengers or announcers of William, Duke William, come to Guy. Okay, they must have heard something about the arrival of Harold. So William is sending his guys to intervene and then to have Harold freed. So we're showing how something nasty happens to Harold, but William's the good guy. He gets him free. Okay, sort of subtle propaganda going on there. Okay, or perhaps not so subtle. Is that the one I just said? Okay, right. Did I click on that one, or is that a different one? Okay, he has him released then at this point. And here he comes to William's court. Okay.
But they keep mentioning that there was the significance of the hawk. Is it just like showing power?
Well, there is at some point where someone else has the hawk. I think at some point William holds the hawk or something like that, and it must represent something to do with things, but I'm not sure what it is. There's a famous 20th century kind of poem which refers to Harold on his horse with his hawk in his hand, as it says, and the H is there. But it must have some symbolism. I'm not sure about that one, what it is exactly. This one is a funny scene, okay? He's meeting with William and so on. As it says, William has got the hawk. But this little bit, as far as I remember, people are not very sure about. What does it say up here? It says it may have been some kind of sexual scandal or something, okay? Ubi unus clericus et, as an Anglo-Saxon name, Alf Giva, or something like that. At that sort of time, this must be a cleric, some kind of clergyman, who looks, I don't know how clear you can see it, but he looks like he's actually hitting a woman in the face, unless he's kind of stroking her face or something like that. And these guys down here, perhaps to suggest the sexual bit, don't have any clothes on, so it's implying that there's something going on. And as the sources, as our historians say, this may have been quite a well-known scandal at the time, but obviously it's something that we've lost now and so on. So they're throwing in extra things which may or may not have been pertinent to the story. I'm not very sure exactly what the significance of that was. It seems a bit odd, but unless it's just a bit of extra thing. Sorry? Yeah, let me just, because it's hard to see when you're... Yeah. Okay. William's got his. Yeah, this is William. It's not here. It's here. There's the hawk, and he's got his kind of flat hair and so. Well, we were just saying we're not sure. I mean, it may symbolise something. It may. The fact that at this point William gets it may indicate some kind of, that already Harold is giving up his independence or something, and that's going over to William or something like that. But I'm not entirely sure. And then we get this expedition to Brittany, which we talked about earlier. Okay, they set off on this expedition against Duke Conan of Brittany, in which Harold supports and fights for William. Now, what do you think the significance of that is? Why is that expedition mentioned? What's that reason for that detail?
Vassal, so somebody who owes you vassal and fights for you, and if Harold is fighting for William, that shows that William is beloved.
Right, okay, yeah, he's fighting not his own battle, he's fighting someone else's battle, which is between the Normans.
It's significant for the battle itself later at Hastings, because Harold knows how the Normans fight, because he's fought with them.
Right.
He knows their tactics, he knows the way that they fight.
That's a good point, okay, yeah, which will be to his advantage in that sense. Whether that's at a significant point in here or not, we don't know. And then, is it here or the next one where, here, William gives to Harold arms, okay, weapons in that sense. This isn't really a kind of feudal thing of becoming a vassal. When you're giving arms, it's more like almost dubbing someone as a knight or something like that. But there is still, the implication is that obviously somehow William is the lord and Harold is below him in this political, social, military hierarchy, and having fought on his behalf, he's being rewarded. So the implication is kind of quite clear that he is underneath him at that point. So that's perhaps the main purpose of this part of the story. Then they go back to Normandy, it says, and here is where Altai, I think, was asking the question. Relics. Do you know what, to understand the significance of these things, what is a relic?
Relics are religious artifacts, I guess you could say, from, like you have pieces of the cross that Jesus was crucified on, or things that maybe dead saints owned, or...
Yeah, or...
They are free to come from Holy Land, or carry something that's for the religion.
Yeah, there's some object, whole or broken, a possession or part of a body or something, which is believed to have come from a holy place or holy person, usually, and therefore considered to have some power, some religious and holy power, and so on. And they would often be the basis of a church. You'd build a church around some relics, and people believed that those relics had power. Therefore, the church itself has got more power, and so on. I don't know what these relics are, okay, but these are it's a sacramentum, they're the holy things. when you swear an oath, when you promise something, I mean, today, okay, I don't know if they still do it in England and America, but you swear on the Bible in court or something, okay? The implication is you will therefore not tell a lie because you promise not to tell a lie by touching the Bible. And it's kind of similar thing here. By touching these holy relics in the church, okay, at Bayeux, that he's promising something. He doesn't exactly say kind of what, but he makes this promise on the basis of these relics, and therefore, obviously, the power of God and the saint and so on would therefore punish him if he broke his oath or promise or something like that. And then he goes back to England. Herald Dux Reversus, or something, reverse suite, or something. No, I can't see what the rest of the word is there, but he goes back, it says. So, the period in Normandy, his little holiday in northern France for a few months or something. He gets captured, he gets released by the work of William, he fights with and kind of for William, then he gets given arms by William, and then he swears some kind of oath, makes some kind of promise on religious relics before going back. Okay, nothing is really stated explicitly. The sentences are all very vague in terms of the details, but the message is more or less there. Then he heads back to see King Edward. Okay, he comes to the English lands, comes to Edward. Okay, and I'm not sure what the significance of this one is. Some people have suggested that Edward is kind of pointing that he's sort of questioning Harold, who's kind of bent over or something like that. I'm not clear. And they also point out, as it says here, that in fact he's shown to be kind of older and sicker than he really was. Okay, Edward's just there to kind of be the king and then die, and he's not a major player in the story. But I don't know exactly what this conversation is meant to be. Then he dies. Okay, more quickly than he would have done. They've missed out all the intervening years. That's not insignificant for things. And here he is being buried and so on. And this is the end of Edward. And then Harold becomes king. Okay, he becomes king of England. Rex Anglorum, king of the English. Meanwhile, all these guys are pointing up to the sky at this. What is this? Do we know what this is? I don't know what it's called exactly in Turkish. It's meant to be Halley's Comet, or whatever. I think one of the earliest references, and they've calculated it must be Halley's Comet. I don't know what it is in Turkish. What's the...
Like a shooting star.
Yes.
Kind of.
Well, yeah, it's going round and again periodically coming within vision of Earth on a very long orbit or whatever it is. And in certain societies, including medieval Europe, things in the sky were considered to be usually evil, bad indications of bad things to come and so on, bad omens and things like this. So at this point, at the very point when he becomes king, they're saying, and I think it actually wasn't at the same time, they can calculate when it would have gone past, but in the same year perhaps. But here, very close to that period, kind of outside the same church, outside where he's being crowned, they're seeing this bad omen pointing to this is a bad event and bad things are going to happen. Okay. So this is a little kind of topos theme, medieval theme thrown in and so on. Obviously we wouldn't think of it in those light today, but it's important, and the medieval people would pick up on the significance of that as we go. And then here is William, okay, receiving news. The news is coming to him of what's going on in England. And then he decides we'll build a fleet. he commands ships to be built. Okay, so immediately he says, this is wrong, there is a problem here. Again, it doesn't say why, it doesn't explain things, it just gives the bare narrative. And then we have so we can jump through these quite quickly. They're quite nice pictures. I mean, for some historians, again, military guys or whatever, they're quite interesting pictures of showing how they build the ships and get the weapons ready. So here are the ships being prepared. Okay, food and drink is taken to the boat and weapons are being brought and so on. Quite nice kind of catalogue of the way that they did things and there, okay. And then William comes and they set sail, okay, they set off. And again, we miss all the details of that, but they were, as Hassan said, they were waiting around for quite a while, allegedly for good weather or whatever it was, before they actually set sail. We have a reduced thing, okay. And here they are sailing across, emphasizing the strength of this fleet and so on. And then they arrive here in England, and the first thing they've got to do, of course, is set themselves up, get supplies and so on, and make sure that they're prepared for things. Oh, wait a minute, I just forgot something very important. I just saw my notes, I should have said. I didn't mention this before. You can't see this. Here's Harold being crowned, and a guy standing on his on his left, our right, it says Stigand, we used to spell it Stigand now, was Archbishop of Canterbury, okay, and the implication, though it doesn't say that, is that he was crowned king by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is quite a common thing, but Stigand was a problematic figure at that time because he was technically, or had been, a pluralist. I don't know if Özge can remember what pluralism is from last year. When you criticize medieval clergy and you say, or modern clergy, and you say, he is a pluralist, what does that mean? Pluralism was holding more than one religious office, benefice, at the same time, okay? And he was Archbishop of Canterbury, but also, I think, Winchester. He also had the bishopric of Winchester, and technically that's wrong. You can have one or the other. You can't claim to be a bishop of both at the same time. And he had been excommunicated by the Pope, I think a number of popes. So his legitimacy as a bishop, and therefore his ability to crown a king, was very uncertain, okay? Now, some of the English sources say that the Archbishop of York crowned Harold, but the Normans, either correctly or incorrectly, but very clearly, are stressing the role of Stigand, because they're therefore saying, if this guy is not really legitimately Archbishop, then he can't really crown the king, okay? So the king has not been crowned properly. He hasn't been properly made king. So here they're calling into question not just the reasons for him becoming king, but the very process of putting the crown and all the other things that were going on. So even the kind of religious side of becoming a king is questioned in this scene here. And then we get the comet, as we said. So let's skip back to where we were. The fleet and so on. And they're arriving here and setting themselves up. And then what have we got here? Chicken on skewers. What's that? Tavuk kebab, or whatever you would call it, and things. They're sitting there, yeah, shish kebab and stuff, and stew or whatever. There is some point, I can't remember where it is now, where there's a number of things I wanted to mention. Maybe that's not so important. And here you see, for example, I can't remember which is the first time, but here allegedly they are identifying William's brothers, including his half-brothers Odo, the bishop Bayeux, the one who is believed to have perhaps commissioned the tapestry, discussing with these important people what to do and so on. And they build what we call a motte and bell, or motte castle, a very characteristic kind of castle that the Normans built, an artificial hill with a little thing on top, and then sometimes they might put something around it and so on, things like that. So they're setting themselves up with a temporary wooden fortification Okay, and then quickly we jump forward to the battle. So nothing about Stamford Bridge, nothing about what's going on in the north, but Harold comes now. Okay, we're ready for the battle and so on. And the battle starts. We're at the day of the battle itself. And here we have some fighting, okay, and reference to some of Odo's followers, okay, very specific mention of certain people, which is why, again, they think this guy had some involvement in all of this. William is mentioned. What does this say? They're approaching. There's the details of coming, and a lookout warns Harold that the Norman army is approaching. And then the final charge and the battle begins. And people are dying, people are getting killed, and so on. Okay. Here, of course, you look at. I presume we've got the kind of English infantry being attacked primarily by the Norman cavalry, as we mentioned before. You can see the different kinds of soldier in these images, which is important. And there they show Harold's brothers both being killed. And then again, Odo is fighting, and I think this is meant to be Odo. He's a bishop. So why the hell he's sitting on a horse beating people up? But as it says here, he's technically not involved in fighting. We discussed the case of the Cain Adhavnan, the law of the innocents in Ireland a few weeks ago. Okay, the same basic idea. Here he is dressed up and he's carrying some kind of a wooden stick, or it says a club there, so that he doesn't actually cut someone and things like that. But he's very in the thick of it. He's a kind of one of the heroes of all of this. Whoops. And something to do with the banner given there. It may, if they identify this banner which Count Eustace is carrying, it's the one that came from the Pope, and as Hassan said, you've got papal support. So the support of the most important religious figure in Europe, okay, to give legitimacy to the invasion. Okay, and I think here is where we have our controversy that we were talking about before in the presentation, okay? In general and traditionally, and still in most cases, people think that this guy with the arrow sticking obviously into his eye is Harold, okay? This is Harold dying, and it does say Harold Rex, okay? But then the sentence carries on, okay? Interfectus est, he is killed. So this may refer to him as well. Okay, this is the general image that we have, and the idea that he was killed there. And I think there is some significance to the idea of someone being killed with an arrow in the eye or something like that. So it may be that was an element of this. But there is still some controversy about whether it's this one or whether it's the guy on the horse being killed and collapsing and so on. But the message is still the same. Harold is killed, which effectively marks the end of the battle, because the leader, the central figure of it all, is gone. And I think this is the last one now. Battle is over, and so on. I think some parts, there's a few scenes missing that have disappeared, which is a shame, and presumably leading up, I'd like to think, to William's own coronation on Christmas Day, but that's not indicated there as it says. So, we can see, we've seen a few elements of the propaganda coming through, okay? Now there's a lot more things, and we haven't even looked at what these little, most of the time these little images below are kind of little comments on the main scenes. We mentioned the naked people for that scandal, well, that's about it. So it's, in itself, it's a fairly simple linear narrative, beginning to end, telling the story. The interesting thing is it describes the main events. This happens, he goes here, this happens, he dies, and so on. It doesn't add the second layer of commentary. Very deliberately, it seems to me, it doesn't say why. It doesn't say this happens because. He's saying this. He tells him to do this. He just says he goes here, and so on. So whether deliberately or because it's expecting people to know the reasons at the time, it makes it a bit more kind of difficult for us to interpret because we don't get all those details now and so on. We have to rely on other sources. But to me, anyway, it does seem to be a clear statement of kind of Norman propaganda, whether it was made in England under Odo Bayeux, whether it was made back in Normandy under William's wife and her ladies, is kind of not so relevant. The important thing is that it was seen to be an important thing to create and to get the message across and so on. Because technically, William's claim to be king was quite thin. Okay, he claimed to have been promised the throne by Edward, but so did Harold. Harold had been proclaimed king by the English and selected by the Wittengamot, as we said before. So William's case was based primarily on vague claims, plus the fact that he won the battle. And so this is one of the ways in which he or his brother or his wife or someone else supporting him kind of wanted to sort of present things and to support their case. And as we shall look at next week, the early years of the invasion for quite a while led to there were a series of rebellions against the Normans, and they had a lot of trouble, particularly in the north and so on. So it wasn't a simple takeover. On Christmas Day, 1066, they don't say that's the end of Anglo-Saxon England and William is in place. Things could have gone either way for quite a while, and we'll examine those things starting on Tuesday. Okay.